Okay, I think we're about ready to start off. To all of the panelists, when you are not speaking, please make sure that your mics are muted so we don't have any background noise. Thank you everyone for logging in to our next WRJ Women Act webinar. Today we'll be discussing WRJ's deep connection to the United Nations. I'm going to turn it over to Jane Taves, our WRJ Vice President of Advocacy, Marketing, and Communication, to introduce our expert speakers today.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy you're here with us. This topic of WRJ's connection to the United Nations is really meaningful to me, in part because until I joined the WRJ board a few years ago, I was completely unaware of the connection or the work we do at the UN, and I am continually impressed when I hear more and more about it. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. Our first speaker is Rabbi Jodie Gordon. She's a rabbi and educational director at Heber Congregation in Great Barrington, Mass. Originally from Rockville Center, New York, Rabbi Gordon grew up with strong connections in the Reformed Jewish movement, especially through her time at URJ Eisner Camp, which instilled in her a lifelong love of Jewish learning and the Berkshires. Rabbi Gordon attended Brandeis University, where she earned a degree in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies and was ordained at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in New York in 2014. WRJ's first executive director, Jane Evans, was the focus of her graduate thesis. Rabbi Gordon is passionate about her work, helping individuals and families find meaningful ways to live Jewishly on Jewish time. Welcome, Rabbi Gordon. And our second speaker is Leslie Brier. Leslie currently serves as the WRJ representative to the United Nations. Leslie represents WRJ at the global level as she monitors our 6 high priority issues. She's previously served on the WRJ Executive Committee, Resolutions Committee, and Global Affiliates Committee, among other leadership positions. Leslie is also an active member of Mainline Reform Temple Beth Elohim Sisterhood in Wynwood, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Leslie. So I will turn this over then to Rabbi Jodie Gordon.
Well, hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I think I am probably in a very fortunate minority of rabbis who have the opportunity to go back to their thesis and find the opportunity to mine it again and to have the opportunity to teach it. So thank you so much for inviting me. So we're going to talk a little bit about Jane Evans, who I jokingly say I lived with from 2013 until 2014, because once I learned a little bit about her, I became just really enamored and interested in her in a way that stays with me today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of Jane's story, a little bit of my story where it intersects with Jane. And I'm so excited to have the opportunity to learn then from you, Leslie, having had a little bit of a sneak peek at your slide to see then how that work has really continued. So my personal connection to Jane came out of a really exciting opportunity I had as a rabbinical student to enter a Women of Reform Judaism essay contest. And I was really honored to have won that essay contest. So I got to come to the centennial celebration that was hosted in New York City, and this was in 2013, where my professor and mentor and friend Carol Balin, Dr. Rabbi Carol Balin, spoke a little bit about Jane Evans that day. And I was there to accept the essay award, and I was captured by the story of Jane Evans. My grandmother was a lifelong sisterhood member at Central Synagogue in Nassau County in Rockville Center. I had her pins. I had a real lifelong fascination with sisterhood. And then there was this story, Jane Evans. And the thing that I thought to myself at that time was, how is it possible to have grown up so immersed and entrenched in this reform movement, to know the names of people like Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, right? What 16-year-old regularly cites the names of rabbis, except not to have known the name of Jane Evans? And so I spoke with Carol about this and decided that she would be the focus of my thesis. And I got to go then to Cincinnati that summer and spend a week in the American Jewish Archives in her files. And so a little bit later in this presentation, you'll have the chance to actually see some of her documents, which was really fascinating. So Jane Evans, for hopefully no one is hearing her name for the first time, but she was the executive director of National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods for 43 years, serving from 1933 until 1976. She was visionary. She was a prophet. She was a Renaissance woman. She was a barrier breaker. She was a change maker. And all of it came out of this really, really deeply rooted sense of peace as this ultimate value of not just her Jewish identity, but of her humanity. So a little bit, I think if we can advance to the next slide, it might give you an idea of where we're going. In the context of history, Jane Evans' work, I think, becomes even more important and even more remarkable. When she was hired in 1933, she was hired as an executive secretary. And actually, one interesting thing to note is that the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods had at that point already existed for 20 years under the direction of a man. So she was also their first female hire to run this women's organization, which at the time was really, when it came into her hands, was functioning like a women's auxiliary. And to just trace the context of the time in which she was working and the time in which she lived, right? So Jane Evans lives through 2 world wars. She lives through the Great Depression. She lives through the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War. She lives through the rise of feminism and multiculturalism. And then she doesn't die until 2004. She sees technology. She sees what happens when you have access to the world around you. So my thesis at the time, and my thesis still today, is that Evans really paved the way for women to hold and maintain power in Reform Jewish life. Her personal life is something that remains in the background to all of this in a really interesting way. And that's why you'll see the bullet point noted that I call her in my thesis the consummate, quote, company man. And there's something important about the use of that word man, insofar as she was able to work and present herself in a way that was very different than the women of her time. She never married, she never had children. And in a lot of ways that not only did that remain unspoken and not something that she really talked about publicly, but in many ways, I think it allowed her to do the work the way she did it. So I talk a lot in my thesis about her as having helped to break the stained glass ceiling. There are lots of really wonderful men and really wonderful rabbis with whom we credit women's ordination. And I would suggest that actually Jane Evans deserves much of that credit. Jane's life intersects with women of her time, and as well as at least one who comes before her, women who would have been rabbis, which is how Pamela Nadell talks about them in her book, The Women Who Would Have Been Rabbis. And there's all these interesting ways in which we see Jane Evans emerge, going from executive secretary to soon being named executive director, and in her role really taking on really interesting tactics and habits and roles. So what Jane is able to do is she takes National Federation of Temple Sisterhood and she transforms it from this women's auxiliary to a really powerful constituency on its own. All the while she's creating space for women, right? So one of the first places that we can really credit her with creating new space for women is on the Bima, right? With the advent of programs like Sisterhood Sabbath, or the fact that sisterhood could then be looked to help stand in for rabbis when they were on leave or if they were ill or unable to lead services in some way. She also, in her work, and I'm very happy to share any documents that may interest people if you just leave a note for me somewhere in the Zoom call, a lot of her speeches read as real theological treatises, and they encompass theology and they encompass liturgy. And so I think there's a lot of ways in which we can look to the way she presented herself to be like a preacher. We can also look to her writing and to her speaking and to see a real pastor and a real prayer leader in her. In her files, there were numerous index cards, handwritten in this really lovely looping script, which makes it easy enough to read, where she would offer benedictions and she would share Jewish liturgy as part of her business proceedings. There's also an interesting note in one of her files about how during World War II, she and other women helped to lead Yom Kippur services that year because so many rabbis had in fact been called up. So there's a part of her where we can look to her her work and see that she really helped to break the stained glass ceiling. There's this other important piece of who she is and the work that she did, where she was really also the consummate company man. It's a big deal when she is hired as the first woman to serve National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, coming after Rabbi George Zeppin. She is really, really instrumental in taking the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods from being, an organization where there are women in the kitchen preparing tea and cookies, where they're creating policy and they're creating culture, and the reform movement really follows along with her. It's her ability to really travel in male spheres, I think, that helps her to do that. Her business background is evident throughout. She's an incredible fundraiser. In her own time, she is innovative in her use of technology. There's an amazing story about how when the Honorable Lily Montagu, who is one of those women who would have been rabbis, pardon me, is giving a speech in London, and there is some sort of National Federation of Temple Sisterhood meeting happening in Chicago, she figures out how to have the speech broadcasted on the radio in London and piped through to a ballroom in Chicago so that Lily might be able to address this gathering in the United States at the time. And even so, all of this drills down to why we're invoking her name today and why I will soon turn it over to Leslie to talk about the work she's doing now. So Rabbi Jan Katsu, who is at the HUC campus in Cincinnati, was a close friend of hers, and he's another person who has spoken about her at some length. And there's something he says about her that I always remember, which was that peace and the value of pursuing peace was always her North Star. So it's in 1945 that she's invited to San Francisco to contribute to the writing of the UN Charter. And I thought that it might be interesting for everyone on the call who has access to the video to see some of her writing and some of it that comes out. So not from the UN Charter itself, but other writing that she does afterwards in talking about the significance and centrality of the United Nations to her work with NFTS. So if we can go to the next slide. So I realize that you probably can't read that, but I always think it's nice to see archival material and to sort of get a flavor for what it looked like and what it was. And this is from the American Jewish Archives. It's archival material that I scanned and used when I was writing my thesis. And in it, and I tried to bring printed copies, although I'm realizing they didn't print so well either, you'll see that in this address to a leadership group in sisterhood, she's talking about some of the specifics of NFTS, right? Of the Yes Fund, of the World Union for Progressive Judaism. And on that agenda, you'll see peace and world relations remains, an important bullet point. And I think looking at this, and I believe this one is from 1965, or 63 actually, we can see that even 20 years after the founding of the United Nations and her work on the Charter, that she's constantly bringing it back to her work at NFTS, and she's trying to make the case for peace work as part of the work of Jewish people. So one more document I thought I could show you. We can look to the next slide. This is an excerpt from an address that she gave, or actually remarks when she was moderating, and she entitles it, "What are the Great Issues of Society?" And this is at a panel presented at the NFTS Biennial Assembly 20 years after the Charter, again back in San Francisco, where she's talking about world order and world peace. I'm going to try to look to the printed document to be able to read a little bit more. So she's talking about that, and I can show you here, but I was unable to include it in the slide, that it's at that biennial assembly then in 1963, so a little bit before this, that she actually puts forth a resolution that NFTS and the reform movement should be working towards the ends of the United Nations. So she writes, "Whereas all Jews by tradition and heritage deeply and sincerely believe in freedom for all men, and whereas the United Nations is the great hope of a free and united world and of all minority groups everywhere, and whereas forces of evil abound in our world today, directed by the destruction of the United Nations, therefore be it resolved that the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, in biennial convention assembled in Chicago, Illinois, November 17th to 20th, 1963, so also interesting timing, urges every sisterhood and every individual sisterhood member to reaffirm her faith in the principles of the United Nations." And she goes on with further distinctions about the related organizations. And so I would only conclude my remarks by saying that my original interest in Jane Evans was about her legacy, right? It was about wondering why, when we as active and committed Reform Jews talk about the figures and the people who really shaped the Reformed Jewish lives we live today, why she wasn't a household name. And so it's incredibly meaningful to me then that there are all these people assembled today to hear from you, Leslie, about this work that you continue doing in her honor. And I think that's a big piece of her legacy. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Gordon. I would like to everyone to look over to the chat. Rabbi Marla Feldman also added a little tidbit there of saying that in 1963, WRJ Assembly was also the 50th anniversary of WRJ, and the assembly at which they adopted a resolution calling on the institutions of Reform Judaism to resolve once and for all the issue of women's ordination.
That's right, which is a great story for another time. It was an important year.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Rabbi. That was just fascinating. And now it's just my pleasure to turn it over to Leslie to talk about her work today.
Yes, hi there. So I was struck by the work that Rabbi Gordon did, and looking at the slides that she sent, I really appreciated her, her being Jane Evans, comment on be it further resolved that each sisterhood pledges support and further the aims of the United Nations to achieve a more peaceful world. So that leads me into my conversation. How is WRJ fulfilling Jane's mandate today? Well, as you may or may not know, Women of Reform Judaism has 3 United Nations representatives. Myself as the main representative, and Sandra Abramson and Vivian Bloomstein as alternates. We also have 2 youth representatives, which I'm pleased to say includes our very own Allison Mallinger and Megan Friedlander, who are on the WRJ staff. What do we do, and how does our work fulfill Jane's mandate? Next slide, please. So we attend events and meetings in the Trusteeship Council, the Economic and Social Council, and the General Assembly. And this slide just basically shows you a general layout of the United Nations and how they interconnect. The next slide, please. So all the meetings and events at the United Nations pertain to these Sustainable Development Goals. And if you take a quick look at them, you can see that they're specific targets for areas in food and health and sustainable communities, etc. In 2015, the United Nations governments of the world committed themselves to a transformative 2030 agenda for these Sustainable Development Goals. After years of negotiations, they agreed that all nations would individually and collectively work to achieve these 17 goals. And again, as you can see, what they are. Next slide, please. So there are daily meetings and events at the United Nations. In fact, you could go every day and spend all day there. WRJ representatives attend meetings and events that focus on global issues which echo the WRJ priority issues. And what is really amazing is how many of WRJ priority issues are being discussed at the global level. And these are our 6 issues: pay equity, violence against women, reproductive rights, economic justice and labor rights, Israel and religious pluralism, and immigration and refugee reform. We also support the Israeli mission by attending any meetings or events that pertain to Israel, and anything sponsored by Israel. They often have events talking about their new technologies and things that they're doing at the global level. Did you realize, though, that pay equity is also a global issue? So at the United Nations, to give an example of what they're doing, UN Women started a campaign last year titled Stop the Robbery that raises awareness of the gender pay gap. And globally, not only here, women only make 77 cents for every dollar that men do, effectively being robbed. So the campaign also calls for equal pay and women's economic empowerment, similar to the pay equity initiative that WRJ has. Another example of the UN and WRJ priorities converging is the issue of violence against women. The United Nations is addressing this issue by highlighting and convening high level of forums on human trafficking and child marriage. And again, how amazing it is that those of you on this webinar that attended the last Freed Leadership Conference, you may remember that you all voted and passed the WRJ resolution about child marriage. Regarding the issues of immigration and reform and refugees, the UN member states adopted the Global Compact of Migration in Marrakesh on this past December 18th. The goal of the Global Compact is migration based on choice, not necessity, and it's organized in a manner that serves the needs and expectations of not only the country of origin of these refugees and immigrants, but also the transit and destination country, so that they're all supposed to organize with one another to make this transition smooth and fair and equitable, not only for the refugees and immigrants, but also for the communities in those countries. The outcome document on safe and orderly migration was based on a year preparatory process in 2017, and it was attended by obviously all the member states. And just so you know, member states refers to countries. It's the same. And civil society, which includes NGOs like WRJ. In order to participate in this process, an application was required to receive special status. And there was several thematic sessions in New York, Vienna, and Geneva. And though Women of Reform Judaism wasn't a stakeholder in each of the themes, I felt it was important to apply and attend because there were some issues that WRJ is very passionate about, like human trafficking. And also, just philosophically, I felt it was important to participate in it because migration often affects the most vulnerable, women and children, and we all know Jews are no stranger to migration. And currently, a hot topic at the United Nations is climate change. The Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015, was an essential step to address climate change. To support the efforts to implement this Paris Agreement, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, is going to bring world leaders and also leaders from finance, business, and civil society to a climate summit in September 23rd of this coming year. And he's asking all the people to attend that are in leadership positions to bring, as he says, bold announcements and actions to the summit that will reduce emissions, strengthen climate resilience, and mobilize political will. So by these examples, you can see that there's many issues discussed at the UN, again, that coincide with WRJ's priority issues. But one of the most important reasons, and I say this in every talk to be there, is to bring awareness of the prevalent and thinly veiled anti-Semitism at the United Nations. At the Security Council, no country at the UN faces the scrutiny that Israel does. In fact, all 193 countries combined, how much more often can you imagine that Israel gets cited for human violations versus all other countries? It's 4 times more, including countries like North Korea, Syria, Iran, and Venezuela. At the meeting of the Human Rights Council, which is one of the committees that carries out the work of the General Assembly, they have agenda item number 7, that is at every single meeting, and it discusses the quote-unquote question of Palestine. There is no other country that has a permanent agenda item devoted to it. So what is our role as representatives while we're at the United Nations? So of all the meetings we attend, our goal is to get information about what's happening at the global level and deciding what issues and topics to engage in. This means reporting the sessions information to we write reports after our session. Sometimes we collaborate with the other UN representatives. There's URJ UN representatives and MRJ representatives. So often, if we want to write a report, we'll collaborate, and then we send those to our own offices. And we try and suggest ways for, in those reports, to promote the goals of the United Nations and network with like-minded NGOs. So again, an NGO like WRJ, it's a nonprofit group, and it's independent from government and organized locally, nationally, and globally. And we provide a variety of services and other functions and bring public concerns to governments. Some UN representatives of the NGOs don't vote, but they can make interventions on issues presented at the United Nations. And I have to say that thanks to the World Union of Progressive Judaism, WRJ and MRJ hold dual ground passes in order for us to be able to make these interventions if we're asked to do so. An intervention is a 3-minute statement that a representative of an NGO can use to speak and influence member states by way of information to be included in what's called an outcome document. An NGO has to apply for an intervention, and then you have a better chance of your application being accepted if you go in with other like-minded NGOs and one person represents all of you. The goal is to have your voice and position included in the language of the outcome document. And the outcome document is the final stage for resolutions to be adopted by all countries of the world. It does not necessarily mean that the outcome document will be accepted by all member states and result in a resolution that'll be ratified them. But minimally, when you make an intervention, at least the member states have are made aware of the will of civil society. So in addition to attending meetings and events at the UN representatives also attend meetings of other NGOs, primarily for networking opportunities. I've had some interesting things happen during my involvement with some of these NGOs. As an example, I belong to the Jewish NGO, otherwise known as JNGO, and they meet monthly. It's an ad hoc committee of Jewish organizations comprised of representatives not only of WRJ, but American Jewish Services, Jewish Women's International, some conservative Jewish groups as well. So we meet to discuss issues important to the Jewish people, obviously, and to Israel. And recently, the JNGO has taken up the issue of textbooks by the United Nations Relief and Works Agencies for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. It's otherwise known as UNRWA. And UNRWA supports more than 5 million registered Palestinian refugees and was created in December of '49. And what's interesting is that the reason that there's so many refugees is that this refugee status is able to be passed down from generation to generation. So it started from the war of, when they fled the war during '48 and '67, starting out at about 1.2 million Palestinians. And again, today we're up to 5.2 million registered refugees. So anyhow, one of the topics that was taken, we found out during a fall meeting that the Weisenthal Center funded a new study of textbooks that's used by the schools run by UNRWA. And so just be aware, that the schools are Palestinian refugee children. And we were finding out that these textbooks indoctrinate violence and demonization of the Jewish people. And they also teach that Israel has no legitimacy as a state, which is in clear violation of UN's own rules. And some of these textbooks are even used in UN schools. So the JNGO decided to contact members of Congress to support a bill to defund UNRWA, which would give leverage to discuss the context of these textbooks. The bill actually did pass, and Trump has pressed for reforms as well as contributions from Arab countries, because right at that point, the United States was contributing 30% toward 30% of their budget. So that was a very interesting time. The other committee that I sit on is the Committee on the Status of Women, which happens to be one of the most influential committees in the UN. and it's instrumental in promoting women's rights and documenting, the reality of women's lives globally. The topics addressed here have included child marriage, refugees, and human trafficking. Every year in New York, NGO CSW of New York organizes a conference, and it's always in March. Activists from all over the world gather to discuss issues pertaining to women and girls and to network, share strategies and best practices, and to lobby governments to implement resolutions that empower women globally. The theme of this year's conference is social protection systems, access to public services and sustainable infrastructure for gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. So I'll attend the sessions, report back to WRJ, and follow up with suggestions to promote the work of the UN and CSW that are of interest to WRJ's sisterhoods and women's groups. You may or may not know that each year WRJ has to apply to renew its membership at the United Nations. And the application requires examples of what WRJ has done to promote the work. And we draw examples from the work that WRJ Sisterhoods women's groups that have aligned themselves with the goals of the UN. And I, know we this year, in fact, used the Pay Equity Initiative as part of our application, and other things that sisterhoods have done and that have been helpful are their work on human trafficking and other issues that relate to the global issues at the United Nations. Next slide, please. So as you can see, WRJ works hand in hand with the UN to pursue Tikkun Olam. WRJ's continued participation as an NGO at the United Nations will ensure that the women of Reform Judaism will be an important part of the dialogue that was started by Jane Evans 60 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Just fascinating as always. So we do have some time for questions from those of you who are watching. You can post questions to either of our speakers by typing them into the chat box, which you can access from the bottom of your screen. So we'll wait just a few minutes. And
you can also use the Q&A box, which is also part of your toolbar. So feel free to ask any questions to either of our speakers.
Okay, we're just waiting a minute to see if anyone's typing anything in right now. I loved how the connection between the history of Jane Evans tied into the current issues that we're dealing with. I think that was such a wonderful pairing of the two of you. Allison has sent me a little message, which is a wonderful thing to talk about, which is how can WRJ members get involved in this work? So Leslie, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I will say that I think that if you, as you being the sisterhoods or the women's group, really paid attention to the WRJ priority issues and worked on those issues, that is really very helpful, because when, as I said, when we make applications, again, it's great to draw from those examples. And the other thing is, there's a couple of opportunities that I want to bring up. So one is I've had the pleasure of speaking at many sisterhoods and women's groups and congregations in the past year and a half about the very thing I talked about, what we do at the UN level. And sometimes that has, brought to sisterhoods the ideas of what they could work on in their social, action advocacy. So I'm definitely open for that, and I enjoy those times. I also have somehow found myself giving bus tours. So I did that for the Atlantic District, and but for their convention, where I prepared a talk on the bus I gave it, we went to the United Nations, and then they got to enjoy a speaker afterward from the United Nations. So that's just to keep that out there. And I'm going to work with the other representatives just to keep more better flow, I should say, of information, so you can all be a little more up to date. And once in a while, there is opportunity for a non-UN representative to come to the United Nations for an event. And I would, I suppose, pass those on to Allison, who could make that public, and then you can get a special guest pass, and I'm happy, you know, to coordinate with anyone that wants to go. And so those are ways to be involved.
Yeah, thank you. And I think part of what I'm hearing is that a big element here is to keep your local women's groups informed about this. As I said at the beginning, until a few years ago, I did not know that we do this work. And whenever I share this now with women in my local sisterhood, they're amazed and impressed. And that's part of what Leslie's doing, traveling around, all around North America, talking in person to women's groups about her work. Yep. Okay, so Jodie, since we have a minute, can you tell us a little bit about how Jane Evans influences your work and your rabbinate today?
Sure. So one thing I'll start by saying is I have as I mentioned, like a personal historical connection to sisterhood, and the synagogue where I serve, we do not have a WRJ group. That predates me and my arrival here. And I think about her and the work she did quite a bit, actually. So in a lot of her documents, she was constantly trying to raise people up around her. And I've often wondered if part of her real insistence on lifting up the women around her, I mean, one of the things that I found in her files of the archive were multiple speeches and letters that were honoring other people, right? That's something that she was really dedicated to and really quite talented at, was lifting up, honoring, raising the profile of the women around her, which I think about a lot today in the way that women can work together. I see it amongst my female rabbi peers, people who were ordained within the same general time frame as I was, and what it means to work together professionally, and where we can pick up from where she sort of left off. You know, it's not accidental that she was called a company man, right? I think part of what made her so successful in her time was that she didn't fit the typical profile of what was expected of professional women at that time, right? She didn't have other outside personal priorities, and that allowed her to, at the height, travel 300 days a year for work. I mean, 300 days a year, that's remarkable. You know, she is so instrumental in so many ways. And so you look at her and she sort of exists out of her own context. And then we can look at her now today and say, all right, so how can we take some of the best of who she was and what she did, right? Making it clear that women were not auxiliary to men, right? Women were not born to play support roles in synagogue life, right? Women lifting up other women, really always, you know, in some ways I feel like she is the greatest inspiration I have when I think about what it means to cite and thank others for their words and teachings when I'm using that in my own teaching, because she did that so flawlessly and so beautifully, and in a way was such a model for that. So that's just, I guess, a first pass answer at Jane Evans. I have this secret dream that one day there's going to be some other more formal way to honor her through writing, through publication, through teaching. That day has not yet arrived, but I'll let you know when it does.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I know I have found that sometimes people I know outside of WRJ leadership may not know a lot about the history, but they're carrying this one factoid in their head, which is that Jane Evans helped found the United Nations. Yeah. And so somehow that that has stuck. and is wonderful to know. So we have a couple other comments. Sue Ellen Eshed says she agrees about informing our women about this work and says some kind of summary document of the work WRJ does with the UN would be great to share. I think that's a great suggestion. And then Laurel Fell says she's looking forward to Leslie Brier coming to WRJ Atlantic Pittsburgh Area Day for a panel on the topic of refugees at the beginning of June this year, which is wonderful. Okay, are there any other questions or comments anyone would like to make? Okay, well, seeing none, I want to thank both of our panelists. Spectacular information, and I will turn it back to Allison.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you to everyone who has attended. You will receive an email post webinar. That will have an evaluation form in it. We highly encourage you to fill that out so we can improve this series for all of you. Thank you again to both of our speakers, Leslie and Jodie, and then thank you again to Jane to helping with moderating this session. I hope everyone stays warm and have a great rest of your day.